First of all, thank you so much for your Hello and welcome to our course on transforming addictive patterns of behavior. First of all, thank you so much for being here and welcome to our community. If you haven't already, please make sure that you print off your workbook so you can follow along and do any of the exercises that are a part of this course as they come up. If you don't have access to a printer, please feel free to just pull up your workbook on a tab on your phone or on your computer. Please keep in mind you can always pause the recording whenever you need to take time to reflect, take notes, introspect a little bit, and please make sure that you access the forum inside the Members Lounge where you can post your questions for the live webinars. We do have 2 live webinars a week that you're able to attend and ask your questions there, interact with our amazing, really supportive community. And we also have an online personal development school Facebook group where people ask wonderful questions, share their insights, and support one another in this journey as well. So I look forward to seeing you in there. Today we're going to talk a little bit about what addiction is and the subconscious root causes of addiction or addictive patterns of behavior. And we're going to talk a little bit about the neurochemistry of addiction at a very high level. And then we're going to talk about how to retrain your brain to create new patterns. We're going to go into something that I like to call the issue isn't the issue, it's the effect. And it's going to talk about how it's not that you use an addiction to necessarily move towards something, but oftentimes to get away from something. And when you can go inwards and identify the root causes of what you are trying to escape from and transform that, naturally the addictive patterns of behavior begin to fall away. Then we're going to talk about 9 steps to break through addiction, post-traumatic growth principles, and I'll take you through a little process for how to update any pain points that you've been carrying for a long time in your subconscious and how to sort of clear these things out. And then we're going to talk about healthy habits to really overcome addiction long term. Now, before I begin this course, I do want to clearly state that if you are struggling with a severe addiction, it is important to seek medical help and rehabilitation. I highly suggest an inpatient program where there is structure, mandated withdrawal, and a daily program, as well as a community supportive setting in person. However, this course will be an excellent resource to use alongside a program, as it specifically targets the subconscious mind and the root causes of addiction itself. It is also excellent for addictive patterns of behavior, things like eating, sugar, people-pleasing, codependency, etc. Now, when you want to stop something but you can't stop it, just so you know, that is essentially your conscious mind fighting against your subconscious mind. And there are so many golden nuggets of self-realization and awareness embedded in there, as well as many parts of things bubbling beneath the surface that are creating that behavior that needs healing. And this is what we're going to address in this course. So what are addictive behaviors? Well, my favorite definition of addiction is by Dr. Gabor Mate, who's an addiction expert. And his definition says, addiction is manifested in any behavior that a person craves, finds temporary relief or pleasure from, but suffers negative consequences as a result of, and yet has difficulty giving up. So addictive behaviors can include, obviously, alcohol and any substances, but also things like people-pleasing, work, sex, gambling, love addiction, codependency, approval, social media, the internet, etc. In my opinion, addictive behaviors are compulsive behaviors that we automatically generate at a subconscious level as an immediate response to pain. An example of a compulsive behavior would be something that your subconscious does before you have any conscious say. And in this case, is basically in response to some sort of feeling of discomfort. And this can be either pain, the pain of an unmet need, or suffering, the sort of story you tell around the unmet need, both making you feel a sense of discomfort and then needing to do something almost automatically to cope. So an example of a compulsive behavior, let's say you feel stressed about something related to work or a relationship, and immediately you start scrolling through social media to distract yourself. This would be an example of sort of an immediate response that can even be generated so quickly you don't even notice that it was a subconscious strategy to avoid pain. Now, compulsive behaviors are designed to essentially create some sort of relief or distraction as an avoidance strategy to get away from pain. And they can also be designed to sort of generate pleasure as an escape mechanism from pain. Another example of a compulsive behavior would be something like somebody feeling any kind of sadness, aloneness, or boredom, and then finding yourself doing something like going to the refrigerator to snack on sugar. And this is something that's most commonly associated with the emotions connected to emotional eating. When we are trapped in this cause and effect cycle of going from subtle pain to an escape mechanism, and when this is a subconscious program, because it's something that's been hardwired essentially over time, this can then become a form of an addictive behavior. Now, the ideal response when we feel pain or suffering is to witness our emotions, to get present with them, and then do the work on the perceptions, beliefs, or unmet needs that are underneath that feeling, that are creating the discomfort in the first place. However, none of us get these tools growing up, so of course we go into these compulsive behavioral patterns to try to avoid whatever uncomfortable feelings are inside of us. So let's look at the cost of addictive behaviors. Imagine you started eating junk food frequently, like 50% of your diet suddenly became potato chips, chocolate bars, etc. Then I want you to imagine that your digestive system just stopped working. So you're not able to digest this food properly, rid your body of toxins, and excrete waste. What would happen to your body? Well, your body would start to become a very toxic environment. Now, the same things happen with your emotions. If you are not processing unresolved stories, unmet needs, painful associations, and perceptions that build up in the subconscious, these are like the junk food of the mind and emotions. And what happens is without this processing over time, your emotional state becomes a toxic environment. So one of the major costs of these addictive patterns of behavior is that not only are they this sort of band-aid solution, but they keep the root problem alive because they keep us continuing to avoid looking at it. And when we don't process by looking at what exists that's creating that pain in the first place, this just creates the context for a buildup and more addictive qualities in our emotional state to take place and fester over time. So while addictive behaviors distract temporarily and do this sort of short-term gratification thing for us, they also prevent us from doing the work, and this can be very painful long-term. These things are sort of left to take up real estate in your mind, and you can get locked into a spiral of self-avoidance through pleasure-seeking or relief-seeking through these behaviors themselves. So this is the cycle we really want to break by first identifying what is beneath the surface, working through it, and then taking the steps to end this cycle. So in the next part of this course, we're going to go through the sources of your subconscious pain, and we're going to start doing the work on how to filter this out and work through these things. Where does this subconscious pain originate from? I'm going to give you a little bit of a background. So as we go through life, we naturally experience trauma. Trauma is essentially anything that the body and mind couldn't properly process all the way through, and so it's stored instead and reorganized itself around. Let's say, for example, you're in a car accident. There's obviously this physical response that's quite common for individuals who go through this about getting back into a car after an accident. And it's because the subconscious mind, when something traumatic happens or something scary happens, it gets imprinted by the experience. And then the survival mechanism is activated that says, don't go back in the car, because it's made this emotional association between the car and a lack of safety. Now, the same thing takes place with emotional traumas. Let's say something like bullying takes place. You have a nervous system response when you're around those people again after one really painful emotional experience. Or if it's after your boss is really angry at you, you might still have this nervous system response. Now, all of those nervous system responses, when you re-enter that environment, the next day, 2 weeks later, 4 months later, all of those nervous system responses, feelings of anxiety or distress, those are all signs that you basically got imprinted by that experience and didn't process it all the way through. So if you have a small panic, let's say the next time you see your boss after he's angry, it's essentially a symptom of this. Now, it doesn't mean that all trauma is obviously on the same scale, but if you fully processed an experience and did the work on whatever was disturbing you about the experience, it wouldn't keep coming back as this negative emotional response the next day or later on. So, on a side note, a lot of people who struggle deeply with something like jealousy should recognize too that this is also a nervous system response. It's essentially a trauma response. And a lot of this is actually based out of, if you had a sibling who came along or you had somebody who was taking attention away from you in the household, if you thought as a child that that equated to a greater chance of you being emotionally abandoned or physically abandoned because you weren't getting attunement and attention, if you registered it that way, then jealousy is going to show up as a trauma response for you in your adult life. And intense reactions are essentially a symptom of a trauma response. Old, stored subconscious pain you haven't processed, you see as this really strong pain point that could impact your survival, and so you have a really distressed reaction later on when things are related to a similar stored feeling from the past. So we essentially see reality through this filter of our past experiences at a subconscious level. That filter is our subconscious and the things that we didn't get a chance to properly process. Now, all of our stored associations about people, men, women, the world, the news, politicians, parents, etc., all of this has our personal history overlaid onto it because our subconscious mind is an association making machine. So you don't just see through the filter of traumas, but you can also see through the filter of just belief patterns that you're carrying, that you adopted or got programmed from with your environment. Now, if these things cause pain, then this pain can be happening at a very subtle subconscious level throughout the course of the day. And because we are wired to adapt to our environment, a lot of the time you may not even recognize the subtleties of emotional pain or suffering that you're carrying. So we want to use this awareness to essentially recognize that if we have some sort of addictive or compulsive behavior that we are coping with, we have subconscious associations, belief patterns, or perceptions that are causing it. Because beliefs and thoughts are triggered in our perception, and we experience an emotional response, and then often an automatic action to deal with that emotional response. We will source in this course what yours are and where they come from. So there's somebody who said to me once, genetics loads the gun and environment pulls the trigger. But I think perception of our environment is really what pulls the trigger. Our environment does play a role, but the perception and how we're actually seeing our environment through that past filter of our experiences has a lot more weight than the physical environment itself a lot of the time. So let's look at an example of this whole process taking place where our underlying thought and belief patterns are triggering emotional associations or an emotional output, which is then triggering this compulsive behavior to try to cope with or avoid those uncomfortable emotions. So let's say you're sitting at home and something on television makes you have a passing thought about work. Okay, so you have stimulus on the television. It triggers this subconscious association or a reminder inside of you about work. And let's say your perception of whatever the work situation is that you're reminded of is that you don't feel good enough. Okay, so you've got stimulus, it triggers this perception that you're carrying in yourself that you're not good enough, which is essentially a stored belief or thought pattern. And now the output of that experience is that it causes feelings of stress or helplessness in your body. Now, as a coping mechanism, you might unconsciously get up from the couch, feel this discomfort, and because your brain seeks pleasure or relief when it's feeling pain, you might, without even having a conscious thought process that's like, I feel stressed, let me go eat sugar. You might get up, find yourself going to your cupboard, eating sugar, and this has all happened basically at a subconscious level without your own conscious awareness and say in the process. And so without realizing it, suddenly you're sitting back down watching television with a box of candy in your lap. So this whole process is taking place where stimulus comes in, triggers a stored perception, that perception exists usually in some form of an association as a thought or belief. As soon as those things are activated within your subconscious, there's this emotional output. And now, because neuroscience has proven every single decision we make is based on our emotions, you have this unconscious behavior, this sort of compulsive coping mechanism that takes place without your conscious mind's say. Now, this whole process of stimulus triggering a perception, which activates thought and belief patterns, which produces an emotional response, which then automatically translates to a behavioral response. This happens all day for all of us. And if we don't know what that whole system is that exists within us, then we don't really have control over ourselves in many areas. So, the environment as well. If we look at, genetics loads the gun, environment pulls the trigger, and how it's more so our perception of the environment. I'm going to give you an example for this. The environment can, on a side note, be an impactful cause, okay? Our environment itself can impact us in a negative way, definitely, because we naturally share human wiring that makes us likely to experience challenges in a similar way. But here's where you can sort of see the impact of perception of environment versus environment itself. So let's just say, for an example, that for some reason you get put into isolation for 6 months. Okay, maybe it's like a prison. You're in, solitary confinement, isolation. So you're not allowed to speak to or connect with any people for an entire 6-month period. Now, this would be really traumatizing for many people, especially if you look into the research about how a lack of connection impacts us. And so obviously there would be a really strong traumatic imprint. However, this experience would likely impact an anxiously attached individual, okay, somebody with really strong needs for human connection, differently than it would, for example, a monk who's training for enlightenment and feels deeply connected to God on a daily basis. So our environment plays a role, but it will play a vastly different role based on how we perceive the environment and what needs we can still meet and somehow derive from our environment. So maybe, as an example, the monk can still get some form of his or her connection needs met from themselves in that experience and really being with themselves in their internal reality in isolation, and with God and how they experience that relationship during that time. So obviously, environment is still going to play a role. That's not going to be a necessarily comfortable situation for either human being, but it's going to impact one individual and how they perceive it based on their programming and stored associations differently than it would the monk, okay? So our goal with this sort of recognition is to be able to hack the system and learn how to shift our perception where we can, okay? And still find creative strategies to healthily meet our needs once we source exactly what they are. So you could say in this example, that impact of the environment could be dampened because the monk is perceiving the environment differently. They're perceiving this environment as an opportunity to further connect with themselves and with God, or because they're still getting their connection needs met because they don't see solitary confinement as an impediment to their relationship to God and to themselves. So we really want to be able to recognize, okay, how can we shift our perception in a situation in a way that empowers us, and how can we also find healthy and creative strategies to get our needs met from disempowering situations. And this is when we start to really be able to hack whatever the system is that's producing an emotional output that seems outside of our control. So then what we do next is we start to practice retraining our brain using repetition and subconscious reprogramming principles to sort of hardwire in these new patterns in the areas of our life that we feel disempowered. So I want to talk to you about a little more about this environment perspective for a moment. So there's a wonderful, wonderful TED Talk by a man named Johan Hari, and he talks about the relationship between addiction and environment specifically. And in this TED Talk, he references a well-known experiment by somebody named Dr. Bruce Alexander called the Rat Park Experiment. Now, in this experiment, rats were placed in a cage with no other community of rats. They were in their own version of isolation. And they were offered 2 water bottles, okay? One water bottle was filled with just simple water, plain water. The other water bottle was filled with either heroin or cocaine, based on the type of rat park experiment they were performing. Now, what they found is when these rats were in isolation, they would repeatedly drink from the drug-laced bottles until they overdosed and died. Then, Dr. Bruce Alexander took these rats, a new set of rats to compare the experiment to, and he put them in a place that he called Rat Park. And in this Rat Park, there was a place that they could roam and play and socialize and mate, and there were toys, and there was this environment for connection. And then they were given the exact same access to those two water bottles, the pure water and the drug-laced bottle. Now, when they were inside of Rat Park, they remarkably preferred the plain water. He also found that some rats even put themselves voluntarily through withdrawal from the drug-laced waters in order to better participate in Rat Park itself. So it's amazing because it just shows the intense impact of environment on the situation, on addiction and compulsive behaviors. Now, what I really want to do is sort of dig in another layer deeper into that experiment and pull up some new information from it, which is that we can break down what environment means a step further. So for an extrovert, for example, it might be Rat Park with tons of people and games, right? Like in the human version of this, the ideal environment might be to be around tons of people, to live in this community, to have tons of people inhabiting the same area, to be connected with people all day. For somebody more introverted, it might be that they have a space where there's a couple closer people with more of an emotional connection and lots of books and lots of space and time to think and to create and to do hobbies. So we need to get clear when we think about the impact of this experiment. We need to get clear about what our individual ideal, truthful concept is of a perfect environment. And in order to do this, we need to recognize that it's less about the environment, like the physical location or the physicality of the environment, although that can still play a role, but it's a lot more about what needs we get met through our environment. So the next part of this course, we're going to go through and start to identify some of these things for us to see where our perceptions or stored beliefs and thought patterns are out of alignment, which are causing that compulsive or addictive behavior. And we also need to start identifying what needs are missing from our lives that creates that emotional pain that then creates the addictive behavior as a coping mechanism, still to deal with the pain. And so, to repeat Dr. Gabor Mate's words, it's not why the addiction, it's why the pain. And once we can begin working with that, we start to be able to transform things at a deeper root level.